Due to its incredible instability, the Knesset failed to renew a regulation that allows for the application of civilian law in Judea and Samaria. This means that by the end of June, Israel's heartland might be left without any law and order, and things could be about to get very wild. This is the Israel Guys. Welcome to the Israel Guys, where we believe that in a world of fake news, you should connect to the true and authentic stories of Israel. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and get those comments going down below. Guys, Joshua is out on vacation this week, so you're stuck with just me, but we have a lot to talk about, and it has to do with the application of Israeli law in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and why is this crazy regulation even necessary? We're going to get into all that. It goes all the way back 55 years ago to the liberation of Israel's heartland in 1967. First, I don't know if you heard the news, but on this very channel, the Greening Israel documentary, we just won 2 awards from the highly acclaimed film festival of the Telly Awards. We won silver medals in 2 different categories at the Telly Awards. Couldn't be more excited. If you have not had a chance yet, go over on the channel, watch the Greening Israel documentary. You will not be sorry you missed it. Action-packed, emotional storytelling. It's all about growing trees in Israel's biblical heartland and the hardships, the things that we encounter along the way. We'll put a link down below so you can find it very easily. Make sure you watch the Greening Israel film. And while you're at it, go ahead and plant a tree. It's $25, folks, and it's a way to invest for generations to come in Israel's biblical heartland. Okay. Israel's governing coalition is in trouble. Now, if you're from the United States, it might be a little bit harder to understand. If you're from somewhere like Canada or the UK, maybe Australia, you might understand Israel's politics and the way their government works a little bit better. Basically, in America, we have multiple branches of government. Here in Israel, they have a parliament system. It's basically made up of 120 seats, and whoever can form the majority or form a coalition, which is typically done with 61 seats or more, they're the reigning coalition, and then the leader of that coalition, that government, is basically the prime minister. So we don't have a separate prime minister or president that rules outside of the Knesset, which is Israel's parliament. But right now, I'm going to read a quote from Arlene Kushner, because I feel like this is a very prevalent feeling amongst Israel's citizens. She says, quote, "I'm among the legion of Israeli voters that longs to see an end to our current governing coalition headed by Prime Minister Naftali Bennett from the Yamina Party, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid from Yesh Atid, and Defense Minister Benny Gantz from Blue and White from right below." So basically she's saying she's tired, she's sick of this government because they're supposed to be right-wing. Naftali Bennett is supposed to be a right-wing man, but he is absolutely not, because he's sitting with the far left parties in Israel. Meretz, for one. He's also sitting with an Islamist party, Ra'am, and he's repeatedly had to cave to their demands. Excuse me, which means that he can't get anything right-wing done, because anything he tries to do anything right-wing, then the left-wing parties and the Muslim parties threaten to pull out of the coalition. And if he tries to do anything too much for them, then the right-wingers can threaten to pull out, which basically would crumble the coalition. But he's on thin ice anyways, because right now I believe it's 60-60, because one of the right-wing MKs already dropped out of the coalition, which means that the government doesn't necessarily fall apart, but it also means that they can't pass anything or get anything done, which leads us to the application of Israeli law in Judea and Samaria. We'll get to that in just a second. But the government's also suffering a lot of other blows. 4 of Bennett's key staff members have resigned. 2 of the coalition's members resigned. One of them, she pulled out, and then they were able to bring her back in after kind of like giving in to her demands. And this is kind of how things have been working. People have been either pulling out or threatening to pull out, and then they say, well, okay, what do you want to stay in the coalition? And they present a list of demands, which is typically just things for their party or their voter base, and then they promise to stay in. So you have like Ra'am with the Islamist party. He presents a list of demands for the Arab sector, the Arab voters here in Israel, or you have like a left-wing party that present their demands. The only person that's actually pulled out and stayed out is a right-winger from Naftali Bennett's very own party, and that's why they're barely holding things together with a 60-60 government. So not only do the coalition members have complete control over whatever they want, they can also take down the government anytime they want. So, and it may happen any day. It may happen today, may happen in a few weeks, may happen a month from now. Honestly, a lot of people have been very surprised that they've held things together as long as they have. But basically, it's not from getting anything done. It's just from giving in to the demands of those who are threatening to pull out of the coalition. That's the only way the government's holding together right now. If it falls apart, then the most likely thing that will happen is that elections will be called, which will happen in about 2 months after the government falls apart. Okay, down to the Judea and Samaria bill, or I don't know what we're calling it, the emergency regulations. In 1967, after Israel liberated Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, they had to figure out what to do with these areas. Now, they kind of partially annexed Jerusalem, or at least parts of Jerusalem, but they did not want to annex Judea and Samaria and apply sovereignty here, basically sovereign law. But they also knew that they couldn't just leave it a no man's land, so they had to do something. So what did they do? They enacted the Emergency Regulations, Judea and Samaria Jurisdiction and Legal Aid Law in 1967, which is basically a regulation that allows for the application of civilian law in Judea and Samaria without actually applying sovereignty, which would bring Judea and Samaria into the rest of the state of Israel. This regulation is good for 5 years, and then it needs to be renewed. And for the last 55 years, it's been renewed every single year, except until now, because the government is teetering on this teeter-totter, and members of Knesset realized that they could easily keep the regulation from being passed again. So what happened? Gideon Sa'ar from the blue and white movement, if I'm correct there, he moved for the extension, but the bill was defeated by a vote of 58 to 52. Some people abstained. So actually six votes short of what they needed there. So what does this actually mean? It means that honestly, I haven't read any articles of people that know for sure what it does mean, but it could get really wild in the West. I'll use that term because it could get wild in the Wild West Bank. Obviously, it's not the West Bank, it's the biblical heartland, but we'll get into that and what the possibilities could be for this regulation failing to pass. We'll get into that in just a second. But first, some reactions from Knesset members. Likud Knesset member Yariv Levin. This is so Likud is Netanyahu's party, Bibi Netanyahu's party. They're right-wingers, but they're also fiercely opposed to the current government. They're going to do anything they can to bring it down. Yariv Levine welcomed the result of the vote, saying, quote, "We are one step closer to the end of the failed left-wing government. A government that is unable to pass basic Zionist and security laws has no right to exist." And Religious Zionism Party, Bezalel Smotrich, who is a great guy, great right-wing guy, said, quote, "Tonight it has once again been proven that this government relies on anti-Zionist elements and it cannot take care of the most basic values and needs of Israeli citizens. This government has no right to exist." And the Likud issued a statement that said, quote, "Bennett, go home. It's over. It's time to bring Israel back to the right." Now, Likud is a right wing, but I'm not super confident that they're going to bring Israel back to the right because they have also been willing to sit with the Islamist parties, and they've been also willing to basically make a lot of compromises in the past. At this point, though, I think the public is more than happy to see Likud come back into power because of the crazy things that have happened under Bennett's government. Now, what does this mean on the ground if the regulation, which expires at the end of June, so we have about 3 weeks, what happens if the regulation expires and there's no laws in Judea and Samaria? Well, it's never happened before, so nobody's quite sure what's going to happen, but here's some possibilities. If the bill fails, Israeli citizens who live in Judea and Samaria, at the very least, would not be able to call the police. So basically, they can't call 911, receive their Social Security, renew driver's license, or maybe even be drafted into the military. Other questions are, would Knesset members who live in Judea and Samaria, and there are a handful, there are more than just a few, when the Knesset members who live in Judea and Samaria, would they even be able to continue serving? Would they have to resign? Would that even be legal for them to live here? IDF soldiers, would they even be able to keep serving in the army? Would people still be eligible for health care, which is kind of private, but it's also subsidized by the government? So everything that's running through the government, all the economic services, everything, municipalities, governments, how is this all going to be able to keep functioning? And I guess the bigger questions are, is this going to give an opening to terrorists and violence and crime, especially amongst the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, entering into Israeli areas like the settlements, the Jewish communities, or entering into Israel? Or are terrorists and criminals going to flee from Israel into Judea and Samaria because they know that the police and the army will not be able to function here? We don't know, but I want to ask a bigger question, because obviously the obvious thing is that, hey, the government needs to renew the regulation, right? I would say, no, the government does not need to renew this regulation, because let's ask the question, why is there a regulation to apply Israeli civilian law or sovereign law over an area that it liberated 55 years ago? Why is there a need for that in the first place? Why is there not sovereignty in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria? There's semi-sovereignty in Jerusalem, but why is there not the application of Israeli law through normal processes and normal means? Because this is part of Israel. Israel's biblical heartland is part of the rest of the state of Israel. So why is there even a problem? Okay, I want to compare it to something. The U.S. Embassy Act was passed in 1995, okay, and you're familiar with this because President Donald Trump moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The Embassy Act that called for the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem and the U.S. recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, that happened in 1995 by a unanimous vote of Congress. It didn't actually wasn't put into place until more than 20 years later, when President Trump had the courage to do it, because they kept signing a security waiver that had to be signed every 6 months to basically prohibit the embassy from being moved. That waiver, based on security concerns, was signed every 6 months to keep the embassy from being moved. And it took President Trump's courage to actually stop signing that waiver so that the embassy could be moved and the U.S. could recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. We have a similar situation going on with Judea and Samaria. Israel liberated these areas in a war of self-defense in 1967. They recaptured Jerusalem, recaptured Judea, recaptured Samaria. They have an inherent right to these places because it is their historical and biblical homeland. You have archaeology that proves that the Jewish people were here all the way back to King David's time. Okay, we're talking about 3,000 plus years. You have the Bible all around in these places. More than 80% of the Bible was either written or took place in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria. You have historical rights, legal rights, according to the UN charter that called for a Jewish state to be established, called for settlement in Judea and Samaria, okay? Going all the way back to the early 1900s, okay? I could go on and on. I could get on a rant here, but the point is that Judea and Samaria is an unequivocal part of the state of Israel, and there should not need to be an emergency regulation act that has to be signed or passed and then signed every 5 years just to be able to treat the nearly 1 million citizens. Yes, over 700,000 citizens that live in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, just so that they can get the benefits of Israeli law, so that the police can operate here, so that the military can operate, so that they can get Social Security and get driver's license, and all the other benefits that full Israeli citizens get. There shouldn't need an emergency regulation. Guys, listen. The two-state solution is dead. Everybody admits that, okay? The U.S. may be trying to revive it, but it's not happening. Israel does not need an emergency regulation that's been in place since 1967 just to apply Israeli law in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria. Israel needs to apply sovereignty over its historical, biblical heartland right now. And if you agree with that, drop sovereignty now. Hashtag sovereignty now in the comments below. Let's flood the comments. Let's spam the comments. Sovereignty now, because if you agree with that, Israel needs to hear your voice. They need to hear their own citizens' voice. The government needs to hear it loud and clear, and they need to have the courage to do what President Trump did in moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. They need to have the courage to do the same thing. This is their land. You should have the courage and the backing to do what you need to do in your own country, and that is applying sovereignty over Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, not having to deal with some kind of crazy 5-year emergency regulation just so that Israeli citizens living here can enjoy the freedoms of basic Israeli laws. Guys, Israel needs to hear a loud and clear voice from all over the world, from its own citizens, but also from you, supporters of Israel, that you support sovereignty now. spam the comments, hashtag sovereignty now in Israel's biblical heartland. Guys, gonna get to basically what does all this mean here in just a second. But first, if you have been thinking about a trip to Israel, I was just in Jerusalem for several weeks. We're filming a new series, just finished up, super excited. But you know what I saw in Jerusalem? People are back. Tour groups are back. Jewish groups are back. Christian groups are back. Church groups are back. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people, tour buses all over the place. If you've been thinking about a trip to Israel, now is the time to come. And of course, you need to check out our trips because we host volunteer programs that are faith-based. They're guaranteed to be life-changing, and they start the first week of September this year, and they go all the way through the end of November. We're talking about planting trees, harvesting grapes, volunteer programs all based on agriculture. You get to come and hang out with us. We get to introduce you to the land, the people, and what better way than to show your support for the heartland, talking about the heartland, Judea and Samaria, than to come and actually put your feet on the ground. And this is like beyond a tour. Tours are great, but you get to get beyond the tour bus, get off the tour bus, get off the beaten track, and experience Israel's heartland and the entire land of Israel and the people of Israel for yourself. Okay, guys, we have like a bunch of trips, but each trip is a 50-person cap. We already have more than 50 people signed up for all various trips. So you need to go right now to serveisrael.com. We'll drop the link in the description below. Go to serveisrael.com and check out all the opportunities. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. You need to come to the land of Israel, and you should come this year. And no, it's not too late to start planning. Israel's 100% open. No shots needed, no vaccines, not even any testing, guys, needed. Do you know the U.S. has more regulations that are COVID related than Israel does right now? Yes, that's right. Israel is 100% open, so go check it out. serveisrael.com for a life-changing, faith-based volunteer trip. You can come to Israel this year. Guys, what does this mean? What does all this news mean of Israel's government hanging by a thread? What's currently happening here? A lot of people have thought Israel's government would have fallen apart by now. It's been hanging by a thread amazingly. Every time we thought it was collapsing over the last several months, things have held together. So I'm not going to make any predictions whether it's going to fall apart tomorrow or a month from now. I can't imagine it lasting much more than a month or two, a couple more months. But what are the options? What's going to happen if this Judea and Samaria regulation does not get? They're going to try and pass it again. What happens if they don't pass it and the government holds together? Option one could be that the government holds together and votes to keep applying law to Judea and Samaria. They're exploring other options, like can the military impose law in Judea and Samaria? Doesn't sound like a very good long-term option to me. Another option could be the government collapses and elections are called, which would happen in a couple months. Or the government collapses and another coalition is immediately formed with other right-wing parties, which can happen. All the pieces to the puzzle have to fit just right. But yes, that can happen. But regardless of what happens, the solution should not be to just extend another 5 years of emergency regulations so that almost 1 million people, can live and operate like normal Israeli citizens. Instead, they should be looking at the long-term solution that is after 55 years of Israel celebrating their liberation of Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria. We just passed Jerusalem Day. They celebrated that birthday. After 55 years, sovereignty should be applied to Israel's biblical heartland so that it can be just like the rest of the state of Israel. They did it in the Golan Heights, and the U.S. just recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel. Should not be scared of international pressure. Sovereignty should be applied to Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and it should be applied right now. Then we don't have to worry about all these emergency regulations, getting them passed, and being such a part of the government barely hanging on by a thread. Guys, let us know what you think down in the comments below. I want to know what you think. Sovereignty now? What's the options? Is Israel's government going to hang on? Get that conversation going down below. Make sure to subscribe, guys. Make sure to hit that notification bell. And I want to hear from you. What do you think? Tune out the fake news and tune into what is actually happening here in the land of Israel. We'll be back next week here at The Israel Guys.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. Go ahead and subscribe if you like that content. We can get it to you every week, right there at your fingertips. If you really liked it and have questions, anything, we love comments. Go ahead and leave us a comment as well. If you'd like to even go further, your support would be greatly appreciated. We've got lots of content, lots of ideas that we want to keep pushing out there. If you want to support, you can go to our Patreon page or check us out at theisraelguys.com.